Listen to me very carefully. If you ever finally manage to save up enough money to buy your own house, do yourself a massive favor. Check the neighbors before you sign a single piece of paper. Stake the place out. Sit in your car across the street at 10 o'clock at night on a Tuesday. Sit there at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. Watch the property. Because you can fix a bad roof, you can rip out ugly carpet, and you can paint over disgusting wallpaper. But you cannot fix terrible neighbors. They are a permanent stain on your existence. I learned this the hard way. I am not a violent guy. I am just a regular dude who likes his peace and quiet. I work 40 hours a week doing data entry. I come home, I drink a cold beer on my back porch, and I want to be left alone. That is it. That is the American dream for me. Just absolute, undisturbed silence. For the first 2 years living in my little 3-bedroom ranch house, that is exactly what I had. The neighborhood was quiet. My house was perfectly positioned at the end of a cul-de-sac. The guy living next to me was an old retired postal worker who spent his days pruning his rose bushes and waving at me when I went to check the mail. It was paradise. Then, the old man decided to move to Florida to be with his grandchildren. He sold his house. And that was the exact moment my life turned into an absolute waking nightmare. Enter Karen. I am not using that name as a joke. Her actual legal name was Karen. She moved in about 3 weeks after the old man left, and she immediately made her presence known to the entire street. You ever meet someone who just takes up too much space, like, not physically, but their aura is just loud and obnoxious? That was Karen. On moving day, she rolled up in this massive, obnoxiously bright white luxury SUV. You know the exact type of car I am talking about. It is the kind of vehicle driven by people who absolutely refuse to use a turn signal. She parked this absolute tank of a car perfectly diagonal across her driveway, with the back bumper hanging a solid 2 feet into my driveway space. I am a reasonable guy. I figured she was just stressed from the move. I went over there, put on my friendliest neighbor smile, and introduced myself. I politely asked if she could pull her car forward just a bit so I could back my sedan out to go to the grocery store. She looked at me like I had just crawled out of a sewer. She was wearing these oversized designer sunglasses that covered half her face, looking like a giant, very judgmental bug. She was clutching a tiny, shivering dog that looked like a rat mixed with a cotton ball, and she let out this loud, dramatic sigh. She actually rolled her eyes at me. She told me she would move it when she had the time, and then she turned her back on me and walked into her house. I stood there staring at her front door, completely stunned. It was day 1, and the battle lines were already drawn. Over the next few weeks, things went from bad to worse. Karen had absolutely zero respect for property lines, noise ordinances, or basic human decency. She decorated her front lawn with these incredibly cheap, neon pink plastic flamingos. Not just 2 or 3, she put up at least 30 of them. Her lawn looked like a terrible miniature golf course. Then came the wind chimes. She bought these massive, heavy metal wind chimes and hung them right on the property line near my bedroom window. Every time a slight breeze rolled through, it sounded like a high school marching band falling down a flight of metal stairs. I tried to talk to her again. I knocked on her door one evening to politely ask if she could maybe move the wind chimes to the other side of her house. She laughed in my face. Her laugh sounded like a seagull choking on a piece of dry bread. She told me it was a free country. She could do whatever she wanted on her property, and if I did not like it, I could wear earplugs. Before I tell you how Karen completely destroyed her own life, do me a favor and smash that like button. It helps me know you want more stories like this. Also, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And have you ever had a neighbor from hell? Let me know. I decided to just ignore her. I bought thick blackout curtains to muffle the sound. I parked my car closer to my garage so she could not block me in. I figured if I just kept my head down, she would eventually get bored and find someone else to bother. Oh, how wrong I was. The real trouble did not start with parking or wind chimes. The real trouble started with my mail. specifically an envelope from the local power company. It was mid-October. The weather was cooling down. I had not turned on my air conditioning in weeks, and I certainly was not running my heat yet. I lived alone. My typical power bill was around $80 to $90 a month. I opened the mailbox, grabbed the stack of envelopes, and walked into my kitchen. I tossed the junk mail in the trash, opened the power bill, and took a sip of water. I nearly choked. The bold black letters at the bottom of the page demanded a payment of $640. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes. I stared at the paper again. $640. That was not a typo. The graph on the side of the bill showed my usage shooting up into the stratosphere compared to the previous month. My first thought was that my refrigerator was broken and pulling too much power. My second thought was that the power company had clearly made a massive clerical error. I grabbed my phone and called their customer service line. Let me tell you, there is no hell quite like sitting on hold with a utility company. I listened to the exact same looping track of smooth jazz elevator music for an hour and a half. Every 3 minutes, an automated voice would tell me how important my call was. If my call was so important, "Brenda, why are you not answering the phone?" Finally, a human picked up. I explained the situation. I told her there was absolutely no way a single guy living in a small ranch house used over $600 worth of electricity in 30 days. The representative tapped on her keyboard for a minute. She used that overly sweet, condescending voice that customer service agents use when they think you are an idiot. She told me that the meter reading was accurate. She said electricity rates had gone up slightly, and perhaps I was leaving my lights on. I lost my temper a little bit. I told her I could leave every single light in my house on for a year, and it would not cost $600. I asked her to send someone out to check the meter. She sighed and said she could put a ticket in, but it would take 4 to 6 weeks for a technician to come out. In the meantime, I had to pay the bill, or they would cut off my power. I was absolutely furious. I paid the bill out of my savings because I literally had no other choice. I spent the next entire month living like a paranoid, crazy person. I walked around my house unplugging everything when I was not using it. I unplugged the microwave, the television, my computer. I showered in the dark. I ate cold sandwiches so I would not have to use the oven. I was determined to get my bill back down to $80. The next month rolled around. The bill arrived. I felt a knot in my stomach as I opened the envelope. I pulled out the paper. $920. I literally dropped the piece of paper on the floor. $920. I felt physically sick. That was a huge chunk of my monthly income. Something was completely, terribly wrong. I did not bother calling the power company this time. I knew they would just tell me the exact same thing. I decided to figure it out myself. I am not an electrician, but I am a logical guy. It was a Saturday morning. It had been raining heavily the night before, so the ground outside was soft and muddy. I went to my basement and stood in front of my main electrical panel. I looked at all the individual breakers. Then I flipped the main power switch completely off. The entire house went dark. My refrigerator stopped humming. Silence. I walked outside to the side of my house where the utility meter was attached. This was an older-style analog meter, the kind with the little metal disc that spins around to show power usage. Since my entire house was completely shut off at the main breaker, that disc should have been dead still. I stared at it. The little metal disc was spinning. It was not just spinning slowly either. It was spinning like a frisbee thrown by a professional athlete. It was humming. It was literally vibrating with the amount of current running through it. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Someone was stealing my electricity. I started looking around the meter box. Everything above ground looked completely normal. The thick gray conduit pipe went down into the dirt, exactly as it always had. But then I looked closer at the ground. Because of the heavy rain, the dirt near the foundation had washed away slightly. There, just barely exposed beneath the mud, was a thick, black, heavily insulated cable branching off from the main underground line. It was an illegal splice, done right before the power reached my breaker box, but after it passed through the meter. This meant the power company meter was reading the usage, billing me for it, but the power was bypassing my house completely. I got down on my hands and knees in the wet dirt. I was furious. I started digging with my bare hands, following the path of the black cable. It was buried extremely shallow, maybe 3 or 4 inches deep. I tore up my own lawn, following this black snake of a wire. It went straight across my side yard, right to the wooden fence that separated my property from Karen's property. I looked under the fence. The wire kept going. I stood up and peered over the wooden fence. The thick black wire ran straight across her manicured lawn and disappeared under the siding of a large, freshly built wooden shed she had installed in her backyard about 2 months ago. The timeline matched perfectly. The shed went up, and my power bill skyrocketed. I stood there in the mud, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to know what was in that shed. I walked around the front, marched right up to her front door, and pounded on it with my fist. I did not care that I was covered in mud. I waited. Nothing. I pounded again. Finally, the door swung open. Karen stood there in a silk robe holding a cup of coffee. Standing right behind her was a guy I had never seen before. He was wearing a flat-brimmed hat indoors, a tank top, and he had tribal tattoos running down his arm. He looked exactly like the kind of guy who calls himself an entrepreneur, but actually just borrows money from his mother. Let us call him Kyle. Karen looked at me with pure disgust. She asked me what my problem was. I did not hold back. I told her I knew exactly what she was doing. I told her I found the buried wire. I told her she was stealing my electricity to power whatever the hell was in her backyard shed, and she owed me over $1,500. Kyle puffed out his chest and stepped in front of Karen. He looked me up and down and smirked. He told me I was crazy. He said they did not know anything about any wire and that my electrical problems were my own fault. He told me that if I ever touched their shed or if I came on their property, he would have me arrested for trespassing. He actually poked me in the chest with his finger and told me to get off his porch before things got ugly. I swatted his finger away. I told him I was calling the police right now. Karen let out that awful, high-pitched, choking seagull laugh. She told me to go right ahead. Then, she slammed the door in my face. I went straight back to my house and called the local police department. I told the dispatcher my neighbor was stealing electricity and I had found the illegal splice. About an hour later, a single police cruiser pulled up. A tired-looking officer got out. I walked him to the side of my house. I pointed to the wire in the mud. I showed him the path leading under the fence to the shed. I thought this was an open and shut case. I thought they were going to put Karen and Kyle in handcuffs. The officer sighed. He took out a notepad, scribbled a few things down, and shook his head. He told me that because the wire was buried and he could not visually confirm exactly what it was connected to inside the shed without a warrant, he could not do anything. He told me this was a civil matter. A civil matter? Are you kidding me? Someone is literally robbing me blind every single hour of the day, and it is a civil matter. He told me I needed to call the city code enforcement office or sue them in small claims court. He said he would knock on their door and ask them about it, but if they denied it, his hands were tied. I watched him walk over to Karen's house. He knocked. Kyle answered. They talked for about 2 minutes. Kyle smiled, shook his head, and pointed at my house. The officer nodded, walked back to me, and said they denied everything. He told me not to take matters into my own hands, got in his cruiser, and drove away. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the wall, completely defeated. Suing them would take months. Calling code enforcement would take months. The power company told me it would take weeks to send a technician. In the meantime, I was bleeding money. I could not afford another $1,000 bill. I would lose my house. I felt completely trapped. I poured myself a glass of cheap whiskey and sat at my kitchen table. Then, an idea hit me. Or rather, a memory hit me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found a name I had not called in a few years. Derek. Let me explain Derek to you. Derek and I grew up together. Derek is not a normal guy. When we were 12 years old, while I was out playing baseball, Derek was in his garage dismantling microwave ovens to build a working laser capable of burning through a piece of wood. Derek went to college for electrical engineering, dropped out because he said the professors were too slow, and spent his time building custom circuit boards for high-end robotics companies. Derek is a mad scientist. He wears clothes with solder burns on them. He drinks energy drinks like water, and he lives for solving complex technical problems. In the best way possible, Derek is an evil genius. I called him. He picked up on the second ring. I explained the entire situation to him. I told him about the wire, the bill, the shed, the police, and Kyle. Derek was quiet for a moment. Then, over the phone, I heard him let out a low, sinister chuckle. He told me not to touch anything. He said he was grabbing his gear and he would be over in 45 minutes. True to his word, 45 minutes later, a beat-up, rusted-out sedan pulled into my driveway. Derek got out. He looked exactly the same, thick glasses, messy hair, wearing a T-shirt with a complicated math joke printed on it. He popped his trunk and pulled out a massive tool bag and a digital multimeter. We walked to the side of my house. The sun was starting to set. Derek knelt in the mud. He traced the wire. He looked at the splice. He shook his head in disgust. He told me the splice was sloppy, but it was functional. They had tapped directly into the primary feed coming from the grid, bypassing my main breaker entirely. That is why turning off my house did nothing. I told Derek we should just take a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters and chop the line. Cut off their power. Derek stood up and wiped the mud off his knees. He looked at me like I was a disappointed student. He said if we cut the line, they will just splice it back tomorrow while I am at work. We will be playing a game of tug-of-war for months. He said we needed a permanent solution. We needed to find out what was inside that shed. We waited until it was completely dark. Around 2 a.m, we crept into my backyard. We stayed close to the fence. The night was quiet, but as we got closer to Karen's property line, I heard it. A deep, persistent humming noise. It sounded like a massive server room. We peeked through a small gap in the wooden fence. The shed was not completely sealed. There was a vent near the top, and through that vent, I could see an intense, pulsating blue and red light. Derek whispered to me. He said they were running a crypto mining rig. It all made perfect sense. Kyle was a crypto bro. Mining cryptocurrency requires an astronomical amount of electricity. You need dozens of high-end graphics cards running at maximum capacity 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It generates massive amounts of heat, which means you also need industrial fans and air conditioning units constantly running to keep the machines from melting down. Kyle had built a massive mining farm in Karen's shed, and he was using my utility meter to pay the overhead costs. Derek estimated, based on the noise and the power draw, that Kyle easily had $50,000 worth of delicate, expensive computer hardware sitting in that wooden box. I whispered back, asking what we should do. Derek smiled. In the dim light, his grin looked absolutely terrifying. He whispered back. He said mining rigs are incredibly sensitive. The computer power supplies are designed to take a standard household voltage of 120 volts. They need clean, consistent power to operate safely. Derek looked at me. He asked me a simple question. What do you think happens to $50,000 worth of delicate electronics when you suddenly hit them with 240 volts of raw, unadulterated power? I stared at him. I started to smile. If you are enjoying watching this entitlement get crushed, hit the like button. It shows me that you appreciate sweet revenge just as much as I do. Trust me, what happens next is going to be satisfying. Well, not for Karen, of course. We quietly backed away from the fence and went down into my basement. Derek started pulling things out of his tool bag. He drew a diagram on a piece of scrap paper. It was actually brilliantly simple. Because the illegal splice was on my property, we had physical access to the wire feeding the shed. Derek proposed that we dig up a small section of the wire, completely sever it from the power company feed, and attach it to a portable step-up transformer. We would take the standard voltage coming from my basement, run it through the transformer to double the voltage, and then pump that massive surge directly down the black cable and into the shed. It would be a catastrophic overload. Sue. The surge would bypass any standard surge protectors because it was a sustained high-voltage feed. It would instantly fry every single power supply, motherboard, and graphics card in that shed. I was nervous. I am not going to lie. My palms were sweaty. I asked Derek if it would start a fire and burn her house down. I hate the woman, but I did not want to commit arson. Derek assured me it would not. He explained that modern computer components have internal fail-safes. When they get hit with that much voltage, the internal capacitors simply explode with a loud pop, the circuit breaks, and the device dies instantly. There would be a lot of smoke and a terrible smell of burning plastic, but no structural fire. We needed supplies. We waited until the next morning and went to an industrial hardware store. I bought everything Derek told me to buy. Heavy-duty electrical gloves, a massive mechanical throw switch that looked like something out of a Frankenstein movie, and the step-up transformer. We spent the entire afternoon in my basement assembling the device. Derek wired the transformer to a heavy-gauge extension cord, and then wired the output to the giant mechanical switch. We waited for Tuesday night. Kyle and Karen always stayed home on Tuesday nights. We wanted them there when it happened. We wanted them to witness the destruction. At midnight, it was pitch black outside. The entire neighborhood was asleep. I was sweating bullets. My heart was beating so fast I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. We crept out to the side of the house. Derek was wearing a headlamp with a red filter, so the light would not be easily seen. He put on the heavy rubber electrical gloves. Using an insulated cutting tool, he reached down into the mud and severed the illegal splice right at the connection point. The humming noise coming from the shed instantly stopped. The entire backyard went completely silent. We knew we only had a few minutes before Kyle realized the power went out and came outside to investigate. Derek worked with incredible speed. He stripped the thick insulation off the black cable leading to the shed. He clamped heavy-duty alligator clips from our contraption directly onto the exposed copper wire. He wrapped it thoroughly in electrical tape just to be safe. He ran the heavy extension cord from the transformer back into my basement window and plugged it into my 240-volt dryer outlet. We stood by the side of my house. The trap was set. The transformer was humming quietly. In my hands, I held the wooden base of the massive mechanical throw switch. Derek looked at me. He nodded. "Do it," he whispered. I took a deep breath. I thought about the $600 bill. I thought about the $900 bill. I thought about Kyle poking me in the chest on the front porch. I thought about Karen and her choking seagull laugh. I grabbed the handle of the switch. I pulled it back, and I slammed it forward into the closed position. For one split second, nothing happened. Then, the transformer let out a loud, aggressive mechanical groan as it pushed double the maximum intended voltage straight down the line. From across the fence, we heard it. It was beautiful. Pop, 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 bang. It sounded like a string of heavy-duty firecrackers going off inside a metal trash can. We heard the loud sizzle of melting electronics. A sharp, violent snapping sound echoed through the night air. Then, thick, acrid gray smoke started pouring out of the ventilation grate of the wooden shed. The smell of burnt ozone and melted plastic filled the air. I immediately threw the switch back to the off position. Derek quickly unhooked the alligator clips, pulled our wires back, and shoved them into his bag. He took the completely dead, disconnected black wire leading to the shed and simply left it laying in the mud. We grabbed our gear and practically ran into my back door. We turned off all the lights in my house and stood by the window facing the backyard, watching. Less than 30 seconds later, the back door of Karen's house flew open. The exterior floodlights clicked on, illuminating the entire yard. Kyle came sprinting out of the house, wearing nothing but his boxer shorts. Karen was right behind him, screaming hysterically. Kyle ran to the shed and yanked the doors open. A massive cloud of gray smoke billowed out, completely engulfing him. He started coughing violently and waving his hands. When the smoke cleared slightly, we could see the glow of the floodlights hitting the interior of the shed. It was a scene of absolute devastation. Racks upon racks of high-end mining equipment were completely dead. Wires were melted together. Plastic casings were warped and bubbling. $50,000 worth of hardware had just been turned into a pile of toxic garbage in less than 3 seconds. Kyle fell to his knees in the grass. He literally grabbed his own head and let out this primal scream of pure agony. Karen was standing behind him, covering her mouth, shrieking. I walked to my kitchen, grabbed a cold beer from the fridge, opened it, and took a long sip. It was the best-tasting beer of my entire life. The next morning, I was sitting on my front porch, drinking a cup of coffee. I wanted to be visible. I wanted them to come to me. Sure enough, around 9 in the morning, Kyle came marching across the front lawn. He was fully dressed this time, and his face was bright red with rage. He looked like he was ready to commit a murder. Karen was trailing right behind him, looking equally furious. Kyle marched right up to the bottom of my porch steps. He pointed a trembling finger at me. He screamed at the top of his lungs, telling me I destroyed his property. He said I fried his entire farm. He said he was going to sue me for every single penny I owned, and then he was going to put me in the hospital. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked him dead in the eye and smiled. I gave him the most confused, innocent look I could possibly muster. I asked him what on earth he was talking about. I told him I experienced a weird power surge last night that tripped my main breaker. I said my power went out for a second, but then it came right back on. I told him my appliances were totally fine. I leaned forward and looked at him. I said, in a very calm voice, "If your electronics got fried by a power surge, that is really unfortunate. You really should use surge protectors. But wait, your shed does not have a separate utility meter. How exactly were you powering all that equipment? You must have been plugged into a faulty line somewhere." Kyle's face dropped. The red anger drained away, replaced by a sudden, sickening, pale realization. I stood up from my chair. I took a step down the porch stairs. I kept my voice perfectly calm, but I made sure he heard every single word. I told him that if he wanted to call the police to report $50,000 worth of property damage, I would be more than happy to wait right here with him. I told him we could show the police officers the melted equipment, and then we could show the police officers the massive, illegal splice attached directly to the primary power grid on my property line. I told him I would love to see the look on the officer's face when he realized Kyle had committed felony grand theft of utilities. I asked him how many years in state prison he thought a judge would give him for stealing thousands of dollars of electricity to run an illegal crypto farm. Kyle stood there, completely frozen. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at Karen. Karen looked at him. The reality of the situation crashed down on them like a ton of bricks. They were completely trapped. If they reported the damage, they would have to admit to the theft. If they admitted to the theft, Kyle would go to jail, and Karen would be fined into bankruptcy. They had absolutely zero legal recourse. They could not sue me. They could not call the cops. They just had to swallow a $50,000 loss. Kyle lowered his hand. He looked down at the ground. He turned around without saying a single word and walked back to his house. Karen followed him, keeping her head down. I did not hear a single peep from either of them for the rest of the day. I called the utility company later that afternoon. I told them I had a private electrician come out to inspect a weird wire I found on my property, and the electrician disconnected an illegal tap. I told them my meter should be reading normally now. The representative noted my account. They still made me pay the remaining balance of the previous bill, which stung, but I considered it a very cheap price to pay for the absolute destruction of my enemy. The silence that followed was golden. The wind chimes magically disappeared the next day. The terrible plastic flamingos were thrown into the trash. The shed remained completely silent. About 3 months later, a moving truck pulled into Karen's driveway. She and Kyle packed up their belongings and left. I do not know where they went, and I genuinely do not care. A nice young couple moved in shortly after. They planted a vegetable garden and they baked me cookies on holidays. My power bill went back down to $80 a month. And every time I open that envelope, I smile, thinking about the glorious sound of popping capacitors in the middle of the night. Never mess with a man's peace and quiet, and never ever try to steal a man's electricity when his best friend is an evil genius.